Good morning. I'm Regina Hopkins, and I'm the Assistant Director of the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. The Pro Bono Center provides pro bono legal assistance to nonprofits in the DC area. And I'm being joined by Glen, who is the CEO of the Center for Nonprofit Advancement. The center provides technical advice and support for nonprofits in Southern Maryland, DC, and the Commonwealth of Virginia. Just a little information about Glen. He has been the CEO for the Center for Nonprofit Advancement for 10 years. And before that, he was the CEO of the Earth Conservation Corps. He has a BS in sociology and a master's in education with a concentration on guidance and counseling. So good morning, Glen.
Good morning, Regina. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So today's topic, appropriately enough, since you've been a CEO for a number of years, is the board-CEO relationship. How to get it into a good form so that it's a working relationship that supports both the board and the CEO. And so that can be a little bit of a tricky thing. Just to, basically, when I talk to CEOs, oftentimes they have one of two complaints. Either the board is micromanaging them and they don't feel that they have real authority as a CEO, or the board has a too hands-off approach, that they can't get them engaged and involved, and so everything falls on the CEO and they experience burnout as a result. So I guess the question is, how do we, like Goldilocks, how do we get it just right? So why don't we start with the first thing that you hear a lot, which is the micromanaging. Having a board that's too in the weeds, too second-guessing pretty basic decisions, and not sort of focusing in on sort of the big picture stuff.
Thank you for that. And you're absolutely right. I think getting it to the right medium so that it's not too hot or not too cold, similar to Goldilocks, is the key. You also mentioned my term as executive director. It's been a little bit over 15 years now across just two organizations. So I've been able to see a number of different board members, which I want to zero in on because the board as a whole functions well when each of the individuals are functioning well. And from a micromanagement standpoint, what I often realize is that individual members may be guilty of what an executive director would refer to as micromanaging, and others may have it just right. So I think the key is to work with individuals, their personalities, their interests, get them the information they need so that as a unit, the entire board can be on the right page. Now, we often say, or some of our executive directors may say, they're too in the weeds, while others say they're not giving enough. Coming up with a standard for communication and information flow, a standard point during each month, we have found to be a good practice so that everyone has what they need to make the best decisions and to best support our executive directors.
Sometimes I think also it's just, you have board members who are very enthusiastic. They really want to make a contribution. They want to have impact. They want to have a difference. And sometimes they just don't know how to do that. So they get into the weeds or whatever because they feel like they can add value, and they don't know how to not do that. And so so the real question is, how do you do it in a way that channel that enthusiasm in a way that's constructive, and not a way that will I don't know how to put it better, that give it a way that they can really add value as board members and not sort of as free agents, if you will.
Yeah, and then we talk about the list of things to do to keep the organization running at its highest potential, and some of the things that the CEO just can't tackle on his or her own. Identifying some of the items and projects that board members can work on in committee has been helpful. Key tasks and interests, but I do think that when we talk about getting into the weeds for our governing boards, sometimes that's getting into the operations too deeply, and some of our members are more comfortable in the operations. So having that one champion or two champions, or even our board chair, to say and suggest when things are more beneficial for an operational decision, i.e. management, versus when it truly is a governance matter, a board matter.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess the other thing that, in terms of channeling them and giving them things to do, you talked about some of that. One of the things I think that is helpful is when as an executive director or CEO, and I've seen this with a lot of organizations, they often have stuff that they want to do, but, it's important to do, but they never quite get to it because it's never urgent. It's sort of the long-term thing. And I think sometimes having a board member focus in on that, the things that always drop to the bottom of the ED's to-do list, because they're never urgent enough to get to the top, might be helpful for me. Like we used to have nonprofit, when I was at Habitat for Humanity, we would have, risk management was obviously a big thing. And because you're sending out people, unexperienced volunteers to hammer nails and put on roofs and stuff like that, and what could possibly go wrong with that, right? And so,
sure.
so we used to, So what we would do is, we would get a retired businessman who had a lot of experience or dealing with insurance or risk management issues, and have them put in charge of that. And it was never something that really rose to the top of the ED's to-do list, because it was never urgent enough, but it was really important to get right. And so giving them, sometimes, giving them things like that, things that are important to the organization, but somehow no one ever gets to them, maybe another way of having board members engaged and sort of take some of the burden off the executive director.
I agree. And the other item is also what we would refer to as public relations or even fundraising. Having a core list of entities and individuals that the organization could benefit from getting to know better, assigning board members to individuals who are closest to their peer group or colleagues, to really broker those relationships. And some of those relationships can be for fundraising, can be for partnerships and collaboration or other areas. And I think that's something that we can really monitor and track to see how well we're doing in accordance to the strategic plan.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think sometimes surprises board members, CEOs in an unpleasant way, is all of a sudden they've been operating for a number of years with a board, or sometimes there may be a slight change in the term who's on the board, and they find out that they thought everything was going great, and it turns out it wasn't. That there was some real concerns or issues with the board. And I think, the importance of honest, thoughtful, constructive feedback from the board to the CEO is sometimes a challenge. I don't know if you've had experience with that, but I've just had some people who were unpleasantly surprised to find out that the board was unhappy with their performance until it had pretty much was irretrievably broken.
Yeah, and I have seen that, and I think it is in fact unfortunate, because when it's completely broken, we see executive directors being transitioned out of an organization or asked to leave. And if the feedback hasn't been honest to that point, then there's nothing documented about the challenges with performance. But honest feedback is very helpful. I think we have, in some cases, become a sector that enjoys good news or glass half full at all times. And sometimes knowing exactly what's challenged or what's wrong and working hard to fix it is more beneficial. So we do see executive directors that don't get evaluated at all, or some that get evaluations that are very high level, not really giving specifics. So having a board member or two that can have the really honest one-on-one and share things that can be improved can really, really help an organization to move in a more stronger manner.
Yeah, I think, oftentimes you'll have an organization where everybody gets a performance appraisal except for the CEO, because that's dependent on the board, and, they're not always responsive and getting it done. So, that's part of the accountability. But The other part is, being a CEO, being willing to accept that accountability. Sometimes board members or CEOs or EDs like board members that are just going to be, that aren't going to give them a hard time. And
Hmm.
so, how do you get to the stage where you're willing to have a board that's going to hold you accountable?
Yeah, so not being given a hard time per se doesn't lend itself to us stretching for those stretch goals and being as successful as we can be. I think the executive director position is one that, with great accountability, and also, as you say, being given a hard time, allows us to be pushed, because otherwise, at that top spot in our organizations, there's no one to help push us along when we may fall into the rhythm of just doing things the way we've always done them. So I think that's very important. I think it also prepares the organization for a time of crisis when things go disastrously wrong. The board and the executive together can tackle and manage through that crisis. So that accountability is very important. Now, some of our CEOs would say, and I agree, that 360 evaluations of the CEO, of the staff, and also of the board are when we are most effective, because everyone now is understanding how well they're doing in areas for improvement, and then we're really functioning and meeting our highest potential.
Yeah, and the other part of it is, I think you said, when we were preparing for this call about, having people on the board are who don't mind problems, and who sort of say, okay, that's a problem, let's fix it, and having people in that type of temperament on the board to deal with those issues.
Yes, absolutely. Because when there are board members who shy away from problems, we've always seen that they're either leaving the board or falling back and not being engaged to address these issues. And let's face it, I mean, the environment changes drastically. We've seen it through the recession for our nonprofit sector, beginning in 2008, and a host of other matters. There will be huge bumps in the road that require the strongest board members, the most effective board members to deal with those, and executive directors. And unless we're sharpening our swords by addressing the smaller things, we will not be ready when the worst happens.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't need a whole board full of people who are like, yeah, no, no, no. But having a few people in the room to sort of prod everybody, no, no, let's face this issue, is, I think,
Hmm.
helpful. To sort of, because they're willing to, they're like, okay, let's do it, but in a positive way, coming with solutions, I think, is part of it as well.
Agreed. Yeah, identifying problems and having suggested solutions or ideas or best practices to bring with those for how we can address them. Very, very
Mm-hmm.
helpful, very effective.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that sometimes falls to a director and executive director or CEO and puts them, I think, in a difficult position is when you have board members who aren't performing. They're not showing up at meetings, or they don't come prepared, or they're not fulfilling their duties as board members, and so that puts the CEO in an awkward position of essentially trying to sort of, hold their bosses to account. So I guess that's the question, which is, trying to enlist the help of the chair or a vice chair, or if you have a board service committee, having them sort of deal with board members who aren't pulling their weight.
Yeah, this is a big challenge in the sector, and I would say in every organization. The board members are not a peer group of the executive director. They're actually our bosses, if you would, or our leaders. Um, so it is, in some cases, 15, or in our largest organizations at the center, 50 plus bosses, 50 personalities, ideas, and thoughts at a time. It's really hard for the executive director to manage up, which we do very well as professionals, but harder to hold our own leaders accountable for the things that they're not doing which are the things they signed up for. So it really helps when we have a strong chair that doesn't mind confrontation, that is also big on accountability for his or her peers as they might be for the executive that they're managing, and that they can compel members to do their job, to be at meetings, to take on the roles of committee leadership and to function those as they suggested they would. If it's not the chair, then hopefully there's another member, another officer, or even a member itself, an individual board member who is willing to take on that task, because it helps to address these matters very quickly to keep us performing well.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that sort of gets to transitions to the other scenario that we talked about, which is when the board is leaving too much to the executive director or CEO, and oftentimes this happens when they hire their first CEO. I mean, they're like, oh, we have a CEO now,
Mm-hmm.
we don't have to do anything, and so
right.
The result of which is, you got a CEO who can start feeling overwhelmed very quickly.
I agree. And, to be the CEO and to manage all of the operations, to be left to manage the board and staff the committees and fundraising and a host of other things can be a fast track to burnout. So we want to support our executive directors just as much as we do our board members. So there's mutual benefit, a good distribution of tasks and labor, and we're paying attention and sort of managing the load.
So just because you have staff doesn't mean you don't have a role in working for the organization as a board member. It's not just showing up at the board meeting.
So important.
Yeah, and I think for me the other part of it is just so you're not putting everything off on the board, on the staff, and you're working with them so that yes, and part of it is staff investing a little bit of time up front with a board member so that later on down the road they can really do a lot more for you as an organization. I think sometimes particularly if an executive director feels overwhelmed, then the thought of really working with a board member or training them or getting them familiar just feels like another thing that's being dumped on them. But sometimes the investment of time up front will pay a lot of dividends later on if they're helpful in fundraising and things like that, so that they can they can shoulder some of that burden. And so a lot of it is just accepting the fact that something may not get done, but you're going to focus on getting the board out there and carrying their load.
That's right.
In terms of I think the hardest thing for a CEO to do is get boards to fundraise. In terms of no one likes asking for money, and no one likes rejection. And so how do you have any pointers on how you get the board to fundraise?
Yeah, so we have realized that it's best to find each individual member's sweet spot. And for some individuals, it may be, I don't like to ask for money, but I will invite people as my guests to come to the gala or the event during which they will feel the passion of the organization and perhaps be compelled to give, or just warm enough that when someone else comes around to them to make the ask, they will give. We've had others who appreciate making the thank you calls, which is just as important as getting the gift. Hearing from a board member to share appreciation and the impact of those investment dollars is also a very good and healthy role to play. So finding out who we have on the board, making sure that our individual members are in their individual sweet spots is key. And then practice, role play and talking points, and having board members practice making that ask and fundraising is really important. Because if you leave a board after 3 years having a new skill that you didn't have before, and that skill is the effort of fundraising, I think we have won tremendously.
And we're not all gifts are monetary. Sometimes people can give services or make connections in terms of other people who might do a training or something like that. And that's another way of giving. So, maybe having a little bit more expansive idea of contributing to the organization is helpful as well.
That's right. That's a huge point. And I think we also know that the best way to convert individuals to individual donors is to have them out to volunteer at the organization. So some board members may be willing to invite family members, colleagues, and friends to a volunteer initiative at the nonprofit they sit on the board of. And that's one more way to support the fundraising effort overall.
Yeah, and it doesn't, and I think people don't feel like it's like, people feel more comfortable asking people to donate time than money, because of for that reason. Finally, I guess the last thing is, communication between the board and the CEO. I think you've talked a lot about communication outside of board meetings. Just talking to your board, taking their temperature, and maybe working issues, things that are going to be difficult or confrontational, before the meeting and the like. Can you sort of, because I know you like to talk to your board members in between meetings, so if you could sort of just share what your thoughts are on that.
Sure, and I think, as I mentioned, I mean, this is the best advice I'd gotten when I was moving into my first role as executive director, was to really work hard to touch base with every single board member individually in between meetings. And I think our board members, well, I know we're all human, and a lack of information can sometimes lead to a lot of questions. It can lead to just sort of jumping on the side of an issue that what it seems the majority of the members are jumping on, and not having the right information to get to make a solid decision on our own. So that communication in between meetings is helpful to hear from the members about what they know, what they don't know, take a temperature on what their position may be, provide additional information as necessary, to socialize what I would refer to as big ticket items. Socialize something that you're thinking about bringing to the full board to see what the questions may be, so that when you present it, all of those questions are answered. And making sure that people feel comfortable one-on-one asking what they think may be the inappropriate, or I hate using the word dumb, but we say there are no dumb questions, but being comfortable, being vulnerable one-on-one, so that they're more empowered when they come to the meeting. So very important stuff. I think, Regina, you suggest no raw meat, making sure that everything is well chewed by the time it gets to the meeting. It makes for a productive meeting that moves well and doesn't get bogged down in learning on the spot for the 2 hours that you may have them. All as a group.
Right, and I also think even for those people with bigger board meetings, even just an email or something to let people know what's going on, or give them a heads up about something that's going to come up, really, does a lot, does a good bit to just get people ready for the board meeting, so it doesn't become contentious and people feel connected to the organization, which I think sometimes if there's a big lapse, they don't. Particularly we used to have board meetings like once a quarter, and that's a while between board meetings. So people can sometimes feel like they have to get reoriented, again into the flow. So
and the same is true for good news. It's helpful to share in between meetings what's happening, because your members may be interfacing with some of the same people, and it would be nice to know so they can say thank you if you received a big grant from a particular funder, or some great news for an outcome relative to the program. So our board members are our best ambassadors when they know what's going on and they're not caught off guard, whether it's in a good or a bad way in the community. So those updates are very helpful.
Great. And then finally, I guess to sum up, it's like all relationships. I think it sounds like you think it needs some work. You got to work on all relationships. You got to work on it.
Absolutely. And I think that work happens every day. And I love that you relate it to relationships, because we often talk about fundraising in that manner. Building trust, building the relationship, working on it so you can maintain it. And nobody wants their significant other to break up with them. And usually that happens when you're not doing what you're supposed to do. So we want to work on it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Glenn, for taking time to talk to us today about, what is often a thorny issue with nonprofits, but hopefully, appreciate your insight about how to make that relationship a more productive one. So, thank
Thank,
you.
thank, thank you very much, and I also want to thank you for your board leadership. It's great that we're having this conversation because you have been at the top of leadership for the board at the center, and I'm sure for the other boards that you've served on. So practicing what you preach is a really good thing. Also delighted for the center to continue to partner with the Pro Bono Center, you and your team, for the board boot camps. So really good for us to have this immersion and multiple ways to meet board members where they are and to help all to get stronger. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.